Have you ever felt like the more you try to get closer to someone, the faster they seem to disappear? Like one day, everything feels warm, connected, almost perfect, and the next day, you're left overthinking every message, every silence, every small change in their energy. If that sounds familiar, then you are not alone. And more importantly, it does not mean you are unlovable, too much, or not enough. It means you are dealing with a very specific emotional pattern that most people misunderstand completely. Today we are going to talk about avoidant attachment and the painful cycle it creates in relationships, but not in a cold or clinical way, in a real human way that helps you finally see what is actually happening beneath the surface. Because what looks like rejection is often not rejection at all. What feels like distance is often not a lack of feelings. And what feels like losing someone forever is sometimes just a nervous system trying to protect itself from emotional pressure. Now here's the truth. Most people never hear early enough. Avoidant individuals do not leave because they do not feel. They leave because feeling too much too fast becomes overwhelming for them. Intimacy for them is not always safety. Sometimes it feels like losing control. And when humans feel like they are losing control, their natural instinct is to step back even from the things they care about. This is where the confusion begins. Because on your side, closeness feels good. Reassurance feels natural. Communication feels like love. So when you like someone, your instinct is to move closer, to reach out, to fix distance as soon as it appears. But on the other side, that same closeness can sometimes feel intense, heavy, or emotionally demanding. Not because you are doing anything wrong, but because their internal wiring interprets emotional intensity differently. And so a pattern begins. You move forward to connect. They move back to breathe. You feel the gap and try harder. They feel pressure and pull away further. And without realizing it, both people start reacting to fear instead of love. This is why so many relationships fall into cycles that feel almost impossible to break. Not because love is missing, but because understanding is missing. Now think about how this feels emotionally. At first, everything is easy. Conversations flow, attention is mutual, and there is a sense of excitement. But slowly, small changes appear. Replies take longer. Energy becomes inconsistent. Affection feels less predictable, and your mind starts searching for answers. Did I say something wrong? Did I become too much? Did they lose interest? This uncertainty is where emotional attachment becomes painful, because the human brain hates inconsistency. It starts filling in gaps with fear, even when there is no clear evidence of loss. And in this state, most people make one critical mistake. They try harder. They reach more. They explain more. They give more attention, more messages, more emotional effort, thinking that connection can be rebuilt through intensity. But here's the part that changes everything. For someone with avoidant tendencies, increased pursuit does not feel like love. It feels like pressure. And pressure does not create closeness for them. It creates distance. So instead of bringing them back, chasing often reinforces the exact behavior you are trying to stop. This is not about blame. It is about awareness. Because once you understand the emotional system behind this pattern, you stop taking everything personally. You stop interpreting distance as your worth, and you start seeing it as a psychological response rather than an emotional verdict on who you are. But here is where things get even more interesting. Because the same dynamic that creates distance is also what creates longing later on. Humans are wired to value space, to reflect in absence, to notice meaning when something is no longer constantly in front of them. And this is why understanding this pattern changes everything about how you approach emotional connection. Not by forcing closeness, not by chasing validation, but by learning how emotional space actually works in attachment dynamics. Now, before we go deeper into what actually shifts this pattern and what creates real emotional recalibration in these situations, there is something important you need to understand first, because most people never get this right, and it is the reason they stay stuck in the same painful cycle over and over again. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand the exact psychological shift that changes how attachment dynamics play out. You will see why some people regain respect, attention, and emotional presence naturally, while others keep pushing and slowly lose it. And more importantly, you will learn how to stop losing yourself in the process of trying to hold on to someone who keeps slipping away. But first, you need to fully understand what is really happening underneath avoidance. Because once you see it clearly, you will never look at emotional distance the same way again. What if the real problem was never that someone stopped caring, but that closeness itself activated something deep inside them they do not fully understand? To understand this, you have to go beyond surface-level explanations, like they are just not ready or they don't want commitment. Those phrases are too simple for something that is actually wired into emotional development over years, sometimes decades. Avoidant attachment is not a personality flaw. It is a learned emotional survival strategy. It forms when emotional closeness during early experiences becomes linked with discomfort, unpredictability, or emotional overload. In such environments, a person slowly learns that depending on others can feel unsafe, not because others are bad, but because emotional needs were not consistently met or were met in overwhelming ways. So the mind adapts. Instead of seeking closeness for safety, it starts seeking distance for stability. Instead of leaning into connection during stress, it learns to withdraw internally first and physically later. This is not a conscious decision. It becomes automatic, like a reflex that activates before awareness even arrives. At the core of this pattern is a conflict that never fully resolves. On one side, there is still a natural human need for connection, warmth, and emotional bonding. On the other side, there is a protective system that associates too much closeness with loss of independence or emotional overwhelm. These two forces exist at the same time, creating an internal push and pull that can feel confusing even to the person experiencing it. This is why avoidant behavior often looks inconsistent. There can be moments of genuine intimacy, even emotional depth, followed by sudden withdrawal that seems to come without warning. From the outside, it appears unpredictable. From the inside, it is a rapid shift between openness and self-protection. A key misunderstanding happens here. Many people assume that withdrawal means interest is gone. But in many cases, withdrawal is actually triggered when interest becomes too intense internally. Emotional closeness activates a kind of internal alarm system that says this is becoming too much to process right now. The response is not rejection in the traditional sense. It is regulation through distance. Another important layer is how control plays a role in emotional safety. When someone feels that their emotional world is being influenced too strongly by another person, even in loving ways, it can create an unconscious need to regain control. And one of the fastest ways to regain control is to reduce emotional exposure. That reduction is often what appears as detachment. But there is something even deeper happening beneath this surface behavior. Avoidant patterns are strongly connected to emotional self-reliance. Over time, the individual learns to internalize emotional processing instead of sharing it. Feelings are not easily expressed outwardly, not because they do not exist, but because expressing them was not reinforced as a safe or effective strategy in the past. So, emotions get managed internally, which often leads to suppression or compartmentalization. This is where emotional distance becomes a habit, not just a reaction. And when someone with this structure enters a close relationship, the system gets challenged. At first, it may feel exciting. There is connection without immediate pressure. But as emotional investment grows, the internal balance starts shifting. The closeness that once felt enjoyable begins to feel heavier to process. Not because the partner changed, but because emotional intensity crossed a threshold that the system is not comfortable sustaining. This creates a protective withdrawal response. Not always physical distance at first, but emotional narrowing. Less sharing, less openness, less vulnerability. It is a way of restoring internal equilibrium. There is also a powerful emotional contradiction present in this pattern. While distance is used as protection, it often creates loneliness later. When the nervous system calms down, the absence of connection becomes noticeable. But instead of moving directly back into closeness, the system often oscillates between wanting connection and fearing its return. This creates confusion that can last for long periods. Many misunderstand this as lack of love. In reality, it is difficulty tolerating emotional intensity in real time. Another critical point is that avoidant patterns are not fixed states. They are flexible under the right conditions. Emotional safety, consistency, and respect for autonomy can gradually soften the defensive response, but pressure, emotional pursuit, and urgency tend to reinforce the withdrawal cycle. This is why so many relationships fall into a repeating loop. One person increases emotional effort to restore closeness, while the other increases emotional distance to restore balance. Both are reacting to internal discomfort, not intentional harm. But without awareness, each action unintentionally triggers the opposite reaction. Understanding this removes a major layer of personalizing the situation. It shifts the focus from what is wrong with me or why are they like this to what system is being activated between us. And that shift is powerful because it changes emotional reaction into emotional observation. Instead of reacting immediately to distance, there becomes space to recognize the pattern for what it is. A regulation cycle, not a statement of worth. When this level of understanding is reached, emotional experience begins to change. Confusion decreases, overthinking reduces, and decisions become less driven by fear of loss and more guided by clarity. Because at the deepest level, what people often interpret as rejection is frequently just a difference in how emotional closeness is processed. And once that truth is seen clearly, the entire dynamic of attachment stops feeling like something happening to you and starts feeling like something you can finally understand from a grounded place. When emotional distance starts showing up, most people immediately assume they need to do more. More explaining, more checking in, more effort to restore what feels like it is fading. But this instinct, although deeply human, is often the exact reason the gap becomes wider instead of smaller. There is a hidden emotional law at work in attachment dynamics. The more pressure a person feels in a relational space, the more their internal system tries to create breathing room. This does not happen because of a lack of care, but because the nervous system prioritizes regulation over connection when it feels overwhelmed. So when one side increases intensity, the other side often responds by reducing exposure. It is not a conversation happening through words. It is a conversation happening through emotional thresholds. What makes this even more complex is that effort itself can become misinterpreted. In many cases, strong emotional availability is seen as reassurance on one side but experienced as demand on the other. This difference in perception creates a silent disconnect where both people believe they are doing what is right, yet both feel misunderstood. At this point, a crucial turning point becomes possible, but only if behavior changes direction. Not toward pursuit, but toward internal stability. Emotional stability does not mean shutting down feelings or acting indifferent. It means no longer letting emotional uncertainty dictate actions. It means responding from grounded awareness instead of reactive urgency. This shift is subtle on the outside, but extremely powerful on the inside of relational dynamics. When urgency decreases, something important begins to happen. The emotional space that was previously filled with tension starts to quiet down, and in that quietness, perception begins to change. Distance that once felt like rejection starts to feel different. It no longer carries the same emotional charge. Instead, it becomes neutral space where reflection can occur. This is where attachment patterns begin to soften, not through confrontation, but through absence of pressure. One of the most overlooked aspects of human connection is that emotional intensity without space often leads to resistance. People do not process feelings effectively when they feel emotionally crowded. Even positive emotions can become overwhelming when there is no internal room to breathe. So when pressure is removed, even temporarily, the internal system begins to recalibrate. Thoughts become clearer. Emotional memory becomes more accessible, and the absence of constant stimulation allows perspective to return. This is where psychological contrast becomes important. Human perception is highly sensitive to change. Constant presence reduces awareness of value, while absence increases cognitive processing of emotional significance. When someone is always emotionally available, their presence becomes expected. When that availability shifts, attention naturally increases. Not always immediately, but gradually through reflection. However, this does not mean playing emotional games or intentionally withdrawing to create reaction. That approach creates instability, not respect. The real shift happens when emotional independence becomes genuine, not strategic. There is a difference between acting distant and being internally centered. Acting distant still carries emotional dependence underneath. Being centered removes that dependency entirely. When internal grounding becomes the priority, behavior changes naturally. Responses become less immediate. Emotional reactions become less dominant. Thought replaces impulse. And this changes the entire relational atmosphere. In this state, the need for constant reassurance weakens, not because feelings disappear, but because self-regulation strengthens. Emotional energy that was previously directed outward starts returning inward, creating a sense of internal balance. And this balance is what changes perception from the outside. People are not only drawn to intensity, they are also drawn to stability, especially in relationships where emotional patterns have previously felt overwhelming or inconsistent. Stability creates a sense of safety that does not require explanation. It is felt, not analyzed. At the same time, emotional distance that once felt threatening begins to lose its control over personal state. Instead of reacting to it, it becomes something observed, and observation replaces emotional reactivity. This is where transformation begins to take shape, because in attachment dynamics, the strongest influence is not persuasion, not communication frequency, and not emotional intensity. It is the regulation of one's own internal state. When internal state becomes steady, external reactions begin to shift without force. There is also an important psychological effect that occurs during this process. When emotional pursuit stops, the other side is no longer receiving constant signals that demand response. This reduces defensive activation. And when defense reduces, emotional access becomes possible again. But access alone is not the goal. Stability is reconnection. If it happens, becomes healthier only when it is not driven by anxiety or fear of loss. Otherwise, the same cycle reappears in a different form. This is why emotional control is not about controlling the other person. It is about controlling internal reactions to uncertainty, because uncertainty will always exist in human connection. What matters is how that uncertainty is handled internally. When handled through urgency, it leads to pressure and imbalance. When handled through grounded awareness, it creates clarity and emotional strength. Over time, this shift also changes identity. Instead of seeing oneself as someone waiting for response, there is a gradual return to being someone who has direction beyond a single connection. This identity shift is subtle but powerful. It reduces emotional dependency and restores a sense of self beyond relational validation. And when identity is no longer dependent on reaction from another person, emotional dynamics change naturally, not through effort to change them, but through change in internal orientation. At this stage, what once felt like emotional chaos begins to feel more understandable. Patterns become visible instead of confusing, and emotional decisions begin to come from awareness rather than emotional pressure. This is the point where real change begins to take root, not in the behavior of others, but in the stability of self. When emotional stability becomes consistent, something unexpected starts to happen in relationships that once felt chaotic. The energy between two people begins to shift without any direct conversation about change. It is not loud. It is not immediate. It is subtle but noticeable over time. One of the first signs is a reduction in emotional tension. Situations that previously triggered strong internal reactions start to feel less overwhelming. Messages that once created anxiety no longer hold the same emotional weight. This is not because the situation itself has changed, but because the internal response to it has been rewired through steady self-regulation. This is where perception begins to transform. What once felt like emotional unpredictability starts to feel more like distance that can be observed without panic. And in that observation, clarity begins to form. Human attachment is deeply influenced by contrast. When emotional presence is constant and highly available, the mind adapts to it as a baseline. But when that presence shifts into calm consistency without emotional urgency, it creates a different psychological impression. It feels less like pressure and more like grounded reliability. Reliability has a unique emotional effect. It does not demand attention, yet it naturally holds it. It does not chase connection, yet it becomes memorable. This is because the human mind associates steadiness with safety over time. At this stage, emotional energy is no longer spent trying to repair or interpret every change in behavior. Instead, attention moves inward, focusing on long-term emotional direction. This shift reduces emotional fragmentation where thoughts are constantly scattered between hope, fear, and doubt. Instead, thinking becomes more structured. Decisions become less reactive. Emotional interpretation becomes less personal and more analytical. This does not mean emotions disappear. It means emotions are no longer in control of decision-making. As this internal structure strengthens, external dynamics begin to adjust. The intensity that once defined the connection slowly loses dominance. In its place, a quieter form of awareness develops. This awareness allows both presence and distance to exist without immediate emotional disruption. One important psychological principle at play here is emotional recalibration. When a system that was previously overstimulated begins to experience consistency without pressure, it slowly resets its baseline expectations. What once felt normal begins to feel excessive, and what once felt overwhelming begins to feel balanced. This recalibration does not require explanation. It happens through experience over time. In relational dynamics, this creates a noticeable shift in how interaction is perceived. Communication that was once taken for granted becomes more noticeable again. Emotional availability that was previously expected without thought starts to regain significance. However, the most important change is internal. The need for constant validation begins to weaken. Emotional security is no longer outsourced entirely to another person's behavior. Instead, it is gradually built within personal stability. This is where emotional independence becomes real, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. With independence comes a different kind of presence. It is not emotionally distant, but it is not emotionally dependent either. It exists in a balanced state where connection is welcomed, but not required for internal stability. This balance is what often changes relational dynamics more than any attempt to communicate or persuade. Because people respond differently to energy that is steady versus energy that is emotionally unstable. Steady emotional presence communicates safety. Instability communicates urgency. And urgency often creates hesitation, while stability creates openness over time. Another important shift occurs in how silence is interpreted. Previously, silence may have felt like uncertainty or emotional risk. But with internal grounding, silence becomes neutral. It is no longer filled automatically with negative assumptions. Instead, it is understood as space that does not require immediate resolution. This reduction in internal storytelling is powerful. A large amount of emotional pain in relationships does not come from events themselves, but from interpretations built around those events. When interpretation becomes calmer, emotional experience becomes lighter. As this process continues, a new form of emotional clarity develops. It becomes easier to distinguish between actual behavior and assumed meaning. This reduces unnecessary emotional escalation and prevents small moments from turning into overwhelming internal narratives. Over time, this clarity builds a sense of emotional maturity. Not in the sense of being detached from feeling, but in the ability to experience feeling without being controlled by it. And this maturity has a quiet influence on relational dynamics. It changes how presence is perceived. It changes how absence is processed, and it changes how connection is valued. When emotional dependence decreases, connection is no longer viewed as something that must be maintained at all costs. Instead, it becomes something that is shared freely without fear of immediate loss. This shift also reduces internal pressure on the other side of the dynamic. Without constant emotional demand, the environment feels less intense. And when intensity decreases, defensiveness also tends to soften. This is not manipulation. It is the natural result of emotional balance. At the deepest level, what changes everything is not strategy, but internal alignment. When emotional state is no longer dictated by external responses, the entire relational structure becomes more stable. And from that stability, something important becomes possible again. Clear thinking, grounded emotion, and healthier connection choices that are no longer driven by urgency or fear, but by awareness and self-respect.